Welcome to the Middle-earth Philosopher, where I talk about ideas, people, and relationships within Middle-earth, and try to examine them from a philosophical point of view that people in that world may have held. Aragorn was right. Now, at first, that seems kind of like a no-duh statement, but there is a reason behind why I'm starting out like this. Now, anyone familiar with the books and the movies knows that, of course, this is right because he's the guy who reunites the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, and is part of the team that is responsible for defeating Sauron finally. So, on that note, and that basis, well, yeah, of course he is. However, that's not the reason why I'm saying this, because he's still fighting battles in the Fourth Age with the human tribes of the Easterlings, the Haradrim, and the Corsairs of Umbar, before he finally attains any kind of true lasting peace. The reason why I'm saying that Aragorn is right is because of how he treats these wars and how it differs quite a bit from how his ancestors and predecessors treated these enemies. So to start out with, we have to look at briefly just how did Gondor, and by extension Numenor, treat these people. Well, to begin with, Numenor had ended up souring their relationships with the people of Middle-earth halfway through their own empire's history because of their fault of corruption. They started ruling over people rather than helping them, and after Sauron's corruption, they started taking over slaves and bringing them over as sacrifices. So right off from the bat, they don't like anything associated with Numenor, and that included Gondor as well. But Gondor has its own bag of sins, as it were, that contributes to this. That being that Gondor has as I've stated before in other videos, kind of a low-key prejudice against any other cultures that are not their own, including other cultures that are from Numenor, that being Arnor. They think of themselves as being better and the true heirs of Numenor. And for a time, they pretty much almost achieved that because of their empire building east and south. Several of their kings being having their names changed to reflect this building and these victories and whatnot. But that being said, it also establishes bad blood that admittedly was already there with some of these peoples because of Sauron's influence, as well as just what Gondor was doing overall. So, for example, you have the fact that the Easterlings are considered savage and pretty much hyper-violent, all of which was true, yet at the same time, Gondor doesn't really try very hard to send emissaries over there to, establish an understanding or some sense of communication or dialogue. Same thing with the Haradrim. There's no real communication to understand these cultures and why they hate Gondor so much, other than the fact that, well, they're just not from Numenor, so, there you are. And moreover, the Corsairs have a particularly intense hatred of Gondor because of their more recent history, by a few centuries, of an issue with this Gondorian civil war, where their founders had lost that war, fled to Umbar, established a mini kingdom and their own line of kings, as it were, and then Gondor coming down, killing out that line, and subjecting them again before Haradrim basically freed them up until the War of the Ring. So essentially, Gondor and Numenor had set up bad seeds, as it were, for these peoples to not only hate Gondor and anything associated with them, but to continually to wage war and keep coming back to wage war on them. Or at the very least, if it was this case where Sauron was making him do it, he probably didn't have to try that very hard. So another reason, though, that overlaps with this, and that Aragorn was right, is his own personal experiences. Both the books and the movies either imply or tell that Aragorn was well traveled, that he had traveled all over Middle-earth. And that by itself would have given him a much different worldview than his ancestors and his predecessors, because you could argue that most of them did not have that exposure and that experience. The only thing that they knew of these alien peoples, basically, was that they're under Sauron's influence and they're violent and they keep attacking us, and that's it. And that's pretty much all they needed to know, essentially. And Aragorn is actually going into these places. Admittedly, he's doing a lot of spying and whatnot. But I feel that he's also witnessing and seeing and hearing, what they're saying about Gondor, what they've been told about Gondor and the people of the West. And that, pretty much all of it is not very good. So I think that what ended up happening is that when he does become king and the Fourth Age begins, yes, it starts up with him fighting these wars and everything, but he treats them much more differently after victory than anyone else did. So, for example, it says that Easterlings that were captured and or defeated during their wars with Gondor during the First Age were forgiven and let go and sent back to their people. I don't know how that works, because that's pretty much like letting someone who broke into your house and tried to kill your family out and just saying, hey, as long as you let us be, all is forgiven. But that being said, it seems to have worked. You have the fact that he goes down and he defeats the Haradrim, but they don't come back again after that, for the most part. Also, too, you have the fact that he is giving lands away in the areas around Gondor, like, for example, the areas around Rohan and the Shire, for example, where he gives that to the hobbits and says, this is your land and no humans are allowed on this without your permission, and that he even holds himself to that. So you have this element where Aragorn's empathy, if you will, is allowing him to recognize what had caused these problems in the past and try to resolve them in the future. Because after all, they just went through a devastating war to try to get rid of Sauron finally. And the last thing anyone wants is another round of wars again to happen, even though Sauron's gone. Another way that Aragorn was right is in his integrity, as well as his sympathy. That being that Gondor occasionally had a tendency to not always honor their word. I think there's only one really recorded example of this, where a situation had arisen that one of their kings had been killed in a battle with the Easterlings again, and that that king or the prince or what have you had married a princess from Arthedain, which was part of Arnor when it was one kingdom up north. But they were still considered part of the Dunedain. They were still considered essentially the descendants of Numenor. And Arnor, or I should say Arthedain, which was in dire straits because of their wars with the Witch King, now started calling in favors, basically saying, hey, we need to unite against this common foe because, we're both having the same problem, we think from the same enemy. And the best way to do this is to do so under one crown, and we legally have that right. And Gondor basically told them, yeah, no, we're not going to do that. We don't follow the line of kings through our women, call that sexist if you will, and that we'll find our own king. Thank you very much. And even though Arnor replies back saying that their mutual ancestors did follow the line through women because there were ruling queens of Numenor, Gondor essentially ignores this and just basically tells them, oh, and by the way, we have our own king now. And this king at least had enough integrity to basically try to honor their word with Arnor to assist them in war as soon as he could. But either way, the initial rejection of Arnor's claim kind of sets a precedent that anything that threatened the cultural perspective or worldview and practice of Gondor, regardless of whether you're from the same people or not, was automatically rejected and just not taken. and the best you can get would be a compromise. So Aragorn is not like that. Aragorn, he follows his word, he follows his integrity. Like I said before with the Shire example, he sets the Shire apart, that no quote unquote big people can enter into that land, at least not without the Hobbit's permission, and he holds himself to that, and he shows this through example. So the fact that Aragorn does not hold himself so high, even though he is from a direct line going back to Numenor, that he treats himself as one of the people of Middle-earth, as it were, rather than I'm better than everyone else, shows that he had learned to the importance of that level of integrity. You also see this in the treatment of the office of the stewards, who had ruled Gondor after their line of kings had died out. Even though he was, I believe anyway, well aware that Denethor, who was the high steward, or ruling steward, of Gondor, had no love for him and did not like him, and was very fundamentalist, I guess you can say, in his own ways, that he does not carry that grudge, or any kind of grudge whatsoever, I think, to Boromir or his other son Faramir, who he then makes a steward of one of the regions of Gondor. So he doesn't treat it like you are a political threat to me and I'm going to have to kill you now. Another area where Aragorn got it right was in his recognition of the importance of communities, or at least alliances. Basically, that having lived through and experienced the War of the Ring, he has seen the importance of the need to work with other peoples in order for the equal freedom of everyone altogether. Because without that collaboration, or all those peoples working together against Sauron, you have the elves, the dwarves, the hobbits, for their part, on Gondor and whatnot, Sauron would have won, because Sauron had more or less all the cards. He outnumbered them, even with the lesser amount of people he had from the east. He had more power, I guess you could say, in a way, and on a paper he should have won that war, and he didn't, and that was because everyone was collaborating and working together. And I think Aragorn recognizes this, and you can see that when he has the main gate of Minas Tirith rebuilt from Mithril with the help of the dwarves because of his friend Gimli. The influence of the Fellowship on him, and that close bond of extended family, if you will, chosen family, did affect him very much, and while also giving him connections into these other cultures as well. So he knows the importance of, you're not going to be able to survive on your own, especially if you have an enemy or enemies who already don't like you because of something that your own fathers did. And which leads into the last point in which Aragorn was right, and that through all of these previous points that I've mentioned, what he's establishing to everyone in Middle-earth is that I am not my forefathers, okay? I am not my predecessors. He's telling everyone that through his actions that he is not going to he recognizes that his ancestors did awful and evil things, and that as proud of as he is of his Numenorian heritage, he is also well aware of where they fucked up. Okay, so in his actions, he's letting everybody know that while he doesn't put up with bullshit and is going to be bullied around, at the same time that he is going to treat everyone better and equally, and completely unlike how early Gondor and later Numenor did. And I think in all these ways is how Aragorn essentially establishes in the Fourth Age that, he was right in how he lived his life, how he ruled, and how he chose his actions.